James Brown had been betrayed before. His entire band, musicians he'd trained, invested in, trusted, had walked out on him in Columbus, Ohio, leaving him stranded mid-tour with venues booked, tickets sold, and his reputation on the line. They wanted more money, better treatment, recognition for their contributions to his sound. Maybe they had valid points. Maybe their grievances were legitimate. But all James heard was disloyalty. People who didn't understand that everything he'd built could collapse at any moment, that the only thing standing between him and the poverty of his Barnwell childhood was constant vigilance, relentless standards, and an absolute refusal to let anything slip. So when he found Bootsy Collins, a 17-year-old kid with supernatural talent, the kind of bass player who seemed to channel the future through his fingertips, James saw both an opportunity and a test. Could he mold this raw talent into the kind of musician his vision required? Could he create loyalty through discipline, excellence through fear? Or would this kid turn out like all the others, talented but soft, brilliant but unreliable? James Brown believed he was teaching Bootsy Collins how to be great, how to survive in an industry designed to chew up black artists and spit them out. What he didn't realize was that the methods that had saved him might destroy someone else. That the armor he'd built to protect himself might be a weapon when turned on a 17-year-old boy who just wanted to make his mentor proud. If you want to hear the real stories behind music's greatest moments, the human dramas that shape the sounds you love, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the truth that never made it into the official histories. March 1970. Bootsy Collins was working at a Cincinnati record store during the day and playing bass in small clubs at night with his brother Phelps, who everyone called Catfish. They had a band called the Pacemakers, and they were good. Good enough that other musicians would come just to watch them play. Good enough that people whispered about these teenage brothers who could make a rhythm section sound like it was alive and thinking. But good didn't pay rent. Good didn't get you out of Cincinnati. Good was just the starting point, and Bootsy knew he needed something more. Some break that would prove to the world what he already knew about himself. That he was born to play bass. That music wasn't something he did, but something he was. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. James Brown's tour manager, voice tight with barely controlled panic, explaining that the entire JB's band had quit in Columbus, just walked off the stage after a dispute about money and respect. Brown had shows booked across the Midwest and South, contracts signed, deposits paid. He needed a replacement band immediately, and someone had mentioned these kids in Cincinnati who could play anything. Could they be in Columbus by tomorrow night? Could they learn James Brown's entire repertoire in 24 hours? Could they step onto a stage in front of thousands of people and perform music so complex, so rhythmically demanding, that it made most professional musicians sound amateur? Bootsy said yes, before the tour manager finished asking. He and Catfish called the rest of their band, canceled everything in their lives that wasn't this opportunity, and drove through the night to Columbus. They arrived at the venue exhausted, nervous, carrying their instruments and a naive confidence that talent would be enough. James Brown was waiting for them in the empty theater, standing on the stage under a single work light, his presence somehow larger than his actual physical size. He didn't smile. He didn't offer encouragement or welcome. He simply started calling out songs. Give It Up or Turn It Loose, Sex Machine, Superbad, and expected them to follow. What happened over the next 8 hours was simultaneously the most thrilling and most terrifying experience of Bootsy's young life. James Brown didn't teach music the way normal band leaders did. He didn't explain theory or write out charts. He felt rhythm in his body and expected you to feel it too. to understand intuitively what he meant when he grunted or stomped or made some gesture that seemed to contain an entire musical instruction. Bootsy, blessed with the kind of talent that lets some people translate emotion directly into sound, could follow. His fingers found the bass lines that James was hearing in his head, created the foundation that Brown's revolutionary approach to rhythm required. By the time the sun came up, Bootsy and Catfish and the rest of their hastily assembled band had learned enough to survive a James Brown show. By the time the doors opened that night, they'd learned enough to excel. The next 6 months were unlike anything Bootsy had experienced or imagined. Playing with James Brown meant entering a world where music was both art and combat, where every show was a battle to prove that you were the best, that nobody could touch what you created on stage. Brown's energy was superhuman. He would perform for 2 hours, dance until his clothes were soaked with sweat, sing until his voice was hoarse, and still have enough left over to critique every musician's performance the moment they walked off stage. He noticed everything. A note that landed a fraction of a second too late. A rhythm that wavered for a single measure. A musician who wasn't watching him for cues. Nothing escaped his attention, and nothing was forgiven without consequence. But Bootsy thrived under this pressure, at least at first. He was 17 years old, playing bass for the godfather of soul, creating music that would define funk for generations. The recordings they made during this period, Sex Machine, Superbad, Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine, captured something revolutionary, a sound so raw and powerful that it felt like it was creating new rules for how rhythm could function in popular music. Bootsy's bass wasn't just holding down the bottom end. It was dancing. It was talking. It was becoming a lead instrument in a way that black music had never quite heard before. James Brown recognized this talent and used it, built entire songs around the foundation that Bootsy created. But Bootsy couldn't maintain that distance. He'd worshipped James Brown since childhood, had studied every recording, had dreamed about this opportunity for years. When Brown praised his playing, Bootsy felt like he was floating. When Brown criticized him, Bootsy worked twice as hard to improve. He saw James not just as a bandleader, but as a mentor, someone who could teach him not just about music, but about survival, about how to make it in an industry that devoured black artists and spat out the bones. What Bootsy didn't understand yet was that James Brown's mentorship came with a price that not everyone could afford to pay. James Brown ran his band like a military operation, complete with fines, penalties, and a system of discipline that bordered on psychological warfare. Show up late for sound check? $50 fine. Miss a cue on stage? $100 fine. Wear the wrong color shirt? $25 fine. The fines were deducted directly from paychecks, which meant musicians could work a full week and end up owing money. Brown kept a notepad where he recorded every infraction, every mistake, every moment when someone failed to meet his standards. At the end of each week, he would sit down with that notepad and calculate exactly how much each musician had cost him through their imperfection. The older musicians had learned to game this system, to anticipate Brown's moods and adjust their behavior accordingly. They knew when to be visible and when to disappear, when to take creative risks and when to play it safe. But Bootsy was too young, too earnest, too hungry for approval to develop that kind of strategic thinking. He played with his whole heart every night, took chances, pushed boundaries, tried to create something new within the rigid structure of Brown's musical vision. Sometimes this creativity was exactly what Brown wanted. Sometimes it was a punishable offense. The difference seemed arbitrary, dependent on factors Bootsy couldn't predict or control. There was something else happening too, something darker that the band didn't talk about directly. James Brown was using drugs. uppers to keep performing at his superhuman pace, downers to sleep after shows that left him too wired to rest. The drugs made his moods even more unpredictable, could turn a small mistake into a crisis, could transform praise into criticism in the space of a single breath. Musicians learned to read the signs, the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the tone of his voice during sound check. These clues might give you enough warning to avoid being the target when Brown's frustration needed an outlet. Winter 1970. The tour brought them back to Cincinnati, Bootsy's hometown, the place where he dreamed of making it big. For Bootsy, this show had to be perfect. The Gardens was packed, bodies pressed together, the air already electric with anticipation before the first note played. James Brown's shows were events, cultural moments where black excellence was celebrated without compromise or apology. The audience came dressed in their finest, came ready to dance and shout and lose themselves in music that made them feel powerful and seen. Bootsy felt the weight of this responsibility as he strapped on his bass, felt the magnitude of what they were about to create. The show started strong. The JBs locked into that pocket that made James Brown's music feel like it was rewiring your nervous system, making it impossible to stand still, impossible to resist the pull of the rhythm. Bootsy's bass was thunderous and fluid, creating patterns that were simultaneously simple and impossibly complex. The kind of playing that other musicians would study for years trying to figure out how he made it feel so effortless. James Brown was in top form too, his movements sharp and precise, his voice cutting through the music like a blade. Everything was clicking, everything was perfect. And then came the moment that would change everything. They were deep into Sex Machine. The crowd was losing their minds, and Bootsy was improvising, creating new patterns within the song's structure, pushing the boundaries the way he'd done dozens of times before. But this time, in his excitement and creativity, he let one note fall slightly behind the beat. Not by much. Not enough that the audience would notice or that the groove would collapse. Just enough that it deviated from the machine-like precision that James Brown demanded. James Brown stopped dancing. The change was so sudden, so complete, that it sent a ripple of confusion through the band. Brown's body, which had been fluid and relaxed, went rigid. His face, which had been open and engaged with the audience, closed like a door slamming shut. He turned toward the band, toward Bootsy specifically, and made a cutting gesture across his throat. The universal signal: stop, cut it off, end it now. The music stumbled to a halt. The audience, confused by this sudden interruption, fell into uncertain silence. Bootsy stood frozen, bass in hand, his mind trying to process what was happening. Had there been a technical problem? Was someone in the audience hurt? Why had they stopped in the middle of the song, in the middle of what had been a perfect show? James Brown walked to the edge of the stage, his movements slow and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was loud enough for the front rows to hear, loud enough to carry in the strange silence that had fallen over the Gardens. He pointed at Bootsy and said something that the younger musicians couldn't quite make out, but that made the veterans in the band exchange knowing looks. Then Brown turned and walked off the stage, disappearing into the wings, leaving his band standing there in front of thousands of people with no explanation and no direction. Backstage was chaos. The tour manager was trying to salvage the show, searching for someone who could step in and play bass for the rest of the set. The other musicians were carefully avoiding eye contact with Bootsy, not wanting to be associated with whatever had just happened, knowing that James Brown's anger could be contagious, and that showing sympathy to the fired musician might make you the next target. And somewhere in the building, James Brown was alone in his dressing room, his decision already made, already moving on to whatever came next. Bootsy sat on the equipment case in the hallway, still holding his bass, still wearing the stage clothes that had made him feel professional and important just 30 minutes ago. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, trying to figure out what he'd done wrong, trying to understand why one single note in a 6-month stretch of otherwise excellent playing, had been enough to end everything. The other musicians passed by without speaking, their silence communicating what words couldn't. This was how it worked with James Brown. This was the price of perfection, and there was nothing anyone could do to change it. The tour manager eventually approached Bootsy with the official word. He was fired, effective immediately. There would be no final paycheck. The fines James had accumulated over the past weeks meant Bootsy actually owed the organization money. The tour manager handed Bootsy a bus ticket back to Cincinnati and suggested he leave before the show resumed. Bootsy walked out of the gardens through a side exit, avoiding the crowd that was filing back into their seats for the second half of the show. His brother Catfish found him outside, having also been let go as part of the same purge. They stood in the cold Cincinnati night, their breath visible in the air, trying to process what had just happened. 6 months ago, they'd been nobodies playing small clubs. 3 hours ago, they'd been on top of the world, creating music that would influence generations. Now they were unemployed musicians with no prospects, standing outside a venue where someone else was already playing their parts. What Bootsy couldn't know, standing there in the cold, was that this moment would become one of the most important of his career. The humiliation, the pain, the sense of having been discarded like something worthless. All of it would fuel what came next. Within months, he and Catfish would join George Clinton's Parliament Funkadelic, where their creativity would be encouraged rather than punished, where their innovations would be celebrated rather than fined. Bootsy would develop a bass style so distinctive, so influential, that it would become one of the foundational sounds of funk. He would become a legend in his own right, someone whose name was spoken with the same reverence as James Brown's. But he would also carry the wound of that Cincinnati night for the rest of his life. In interviews decades later, when he'd long since surpassed any success he'd achieved with James Brown, when he'd proven beyond doubt that his talent was genuine and lasting, Bootsy would still struggle to talk about that firing. His voice would get quiet. His usual exuberant energy would dim. He would try to explain what it felt like to disappoint someone you idolized, to have your dream and your nightmare occupy the same moment, to learn that the industry you loved could be cruel in ways you'd never imagined. James Brown never publicly discussed firing Bootsy Collins. In his autobiography, he mentioned the Columbus Band walkout, the challenges of finding reliable musicians, the importance of maintaining standards. But he never acknowledged the specific incident in Cincinnati, never explained his reasoning, never reflected on whether his methods might have been too harsh for a 17-year-old kid. But those who knew James Brown well understood that the firing wasn't really about Bootsy's playing. It was about James's own demons, his own fears, his own trauma. Every time a musician made a mistake, Brown saw the possibility of his entire empire collapsing, saw himself back in Barnwell living in poverty, saw the world taking away everything he'd fought so hard to build. His perfectionism wasn't about music. It was about survival, about maintaining control in a life that had been defined by chaos and abandonment. The methods that had lifted him from nothing to everything were the only methods he trusted, and he couldn't imagine that what had saved him might destroy someone else. Bootsy Collins went on to revolutionize bass playing, to create sounds that influenced everyone from Prince to the Red Hot Chili Peppers. James Brown continued to dominate soul and funk music, continued to demand perfection from everyone around him, continued to lose talented musicians who couldn't survive his impossible standards. The night James Brown fired Bootsy Collins revealed a truth about genius that we don't always want to acknowledge. That the same qualities that make someone great can also make them cruel. That the armor we build to protect ourselves can become a weapon we use against others. That sometimes the people who push us toward excellence break something inside us in the process. James Brown believed he was teaching Bootsy how to survive. Instead, he taught him that survival sometimes means leaving behind the people who can't love you the way you need to be loved. And perhaps that lesson, painful as it was, turned out to be the most valuable thing James Brown ever gave him. The knowledge that greatness requires not just talent and discipline, but also the courage to walk away from situations that diminish you, no matter how much you once wanted to be there.